It was the kind of night that made everything feel heavier. The rain, the sky, even the thoughts that refused to stop circling in my head. And by the time I pushed open the cafe door, soaked and trembling from the cold, I was already one emotional crack away from falling apart. The bell above the door jingled weakly, almost drowned by the low murmur of late-night conversations and the faint hum of jazz from the speakers. I remember thinking how the place smelled like burnt espresso and regret, which felt perfectly fitting because that's exactly what I smelled like too. I was working the closing shift again, because when you're a struggling artist with rent overdue and dreams that don't pay bills, you learn to smile through exhaustion and wipe tables like your life depends on it. Because in a way, it does. The lights flickered slightly, casting golden pools of warmth that never quite reached the corners of the cafe, where shadows gathered like gossipers. I tied my apron tighter, forced a smile, and walked toward the man sitting alone in the booth by the window. He was a stranger, but not in the ordinary sense. Not the kind of stranger you forget after pouring a cup of coffee. There was something about him that didn't belong here, like the world had tried to fit a thunderstorm inside a glass of water. His suit was tailored to perfection, dark as midnight, the fabric too fine for this side of town. His posture, relaxed, confident, detached, screamed of someone who was used to being obeyed without question. But what caught me most wasn't his presence or the sharpness of his features. It was the stillness around him, the kind that felt deliberate, practiced, dangerous. He looked like someone who hadn't laughed in years. I tried not to stare, but my eyes betrayed me, tracing the outline of his jaw, the shadows under his eyes, the faint scar near his temple. He wasn't conventionally beautiful. He was too hard, too severe. But there was something magnetic in the way his gaze seemed to absorb the room, the kind of man whose silence said more than anyone else's words. I walked up to his table, balancing my tray like a peace offering. "Coffee?" I asked, my voice a little too cheerful, a little too desperate to sound normal. He looked up, slow, deliberate, and when his eyes met mine, it felt like the air shifted. Cold, dark, heavy. For a second, I forgot how to breathe. "Black," he said, his voice low and smooth, but with an edge, like a knife wrapped in velvet. "Of course." I turned too quickly, and that's when it happened. The tray slipped, the cup tilted, and before I could react, a splash of scalding coffee poured down his coat. The entire cafe went silent. "Oh my God, I'm so sorry," I blurted, fumbling for napkins, my hands shaking. I didn't mean—" He didn't move. Not at first. He just stared at me, expression unreadable, eyes colder than the rain outside. Every instinct screamed at me to run, to hide, to vanish into thin air. I'd seen that look before, not on someone like him, but on the kind of men who thought anger was the only language worth speaking. And yet, for reasons I couldn't explain, fear turned to irritation. Maybe it was exhaustion. Maybe it was pride. Or maybe it was because I was tired of being the one who always apologized. So I straightened my back, wiped my hands on my apron, and said, "You know, if you're going to stare at me like that, you might as well say something. You look like you eat people for breakfast." It was impulsive. Stupid. Probably suicidal. But the words came out before I could stop them. For a moment, there was nothing. Just silence thick enough to drown in. Then, slowly, impossibly, he smiled. And then, he laughed. Not a polite chuckle. Not the kind of hollow laughter people give out of habit. No, this was deep, rough, unexpected, like something long buried had clawed its way out of him. His head tilted back slightly, the corners of his mouth lifting in a way that softened the sharpness of his face. The sound filled the air, warm and startling, and for one fleeting moment he didn't look like a man carved from shadows. He looked human. Everyone stared. Even the barista paused mid-cleaning. But I just stood there, half shocked, half dazzled, watching this impossible man laugh because of something I said. When he finally stopped, his gaze met mine again. But now, there was something different in it. A spark. A curiosity that felt dangerous in its intensity. "You're brave," he said quietly, as if testing the word. "Or foolish." "Both," I replied before I could think better of it. "Depends on the day." His lips curved again, faintly this time, almost like he was fighting the smile. "What's your name?" "Arya," I said, unsure why my voice came out softer. He repeated it once, as if savoring it, then nodded. "Pretty name." I didn't ask for his. Some part of me, the part that still had instincts, didn't want to know. The rest of the night passed in a blur of strange glances and unspoken tension. Every time I walked past his table, I could feel his eyes on me. Not in a predatory way, but like he was studying something he couldn't quite understand. When he finally stood to leave, he placed a thick envelope beneath the saucer of his cup and slipped his coat back on. I caught the faintest whiff of something dark and expensive. Cedar, smoke, and sin. He paused by the counter, looked at me once more, and said, "Thank you, Arya." "For what?" I asked, genuinely confused. "For reminding me what it feels like." Then he left, just like that, walking out into the rain, his figure dissolving into the night like a ghost that never should have been seen. I stood there long after the door closed behind him, my heart racing for reasons I couldn't name. It was an attraction. Not exactly. It was something deeper, stranger, like I had just brushed against a story I wasn't supposed to be part of. When I went to clear his table, I found the envelope still there. I frowned, glancing around before sliding it open. Inside was a thick stack of cash, way too much for coffee. My breath caught. There was no note, no explanation. Just silence, as if he'd left behind a question only I could answer. I wanted to be angry. I wanted to think he was trying to buy my dignity, or make up for the spill in some arrogant, rich man way. But deep down, I knew it wasn't that simple. Nothing about him was simple. That night, as I locked up the cafe and stepped into the rain, I told myself I'd forget about him, that he was just another strange customer with too much money and too many secrets. But I couldn't. His laughter, raw, startled, unguarded, kept replaying in my mind, and the way he'd said my name, like it meant something. I didn't know that somewhere, in a part of the city I'd never seen, men were already whispering my name to a man who didn't like to share what was his, and I didn't know that the man who laughed, the man whose eyes followed me like a prayer and a warning, was the kind of man who could burn down the world just to make sure he never lost what made him feel alive again. I didn't know any of that. Not yet. But I was about to. People often think that power feels like control. But the truth is, it feels like silence. A suffocating, endless silence that no amount of money, blood, or loyalty can fill. And for years that silence had been my constant companion, my only friend, my punishment and my peace, until she laughed. That night in the cafe, when her words sliced through the monotony of my existence like a shard of sunlight through stained glass, I felt something I hadn't felt in years. A flicker, a pulse, a reminder that somewhere beneath the layers of violence and loss, I was still human enough to react to something as pure as humor. It was ridiculous, almost insulting, that a woman with tired eyes and coffee-stained hands could make me laugh when the entire world had been trying to break me for so long. And yet, I couldn't shake it. Arya. Her name echoed in my mind as I drove through the city that night, the rain blurring the lights into smears of gold and red across the windshield. I should have gone home, should have buried the thought of her beneath 1,000 other concerns. The territory dispute with the Romano family, the money laundering operation in Milan, the the new shipment from Istanbul that needed to be moved before dawn. But I couldn't. Instead, I kept replaying that moment, her defiance, the way she looked straight into my eyes without fear. People didn't do that. Not to me. Not anymore. When you live as I do, fear becomes the air you breathe. People learn to bow before your shadow, to swallow their words, to avoid your eyes. I had forgotten what it was like to be looked at without calculation, without trembling. She didn't know who I was, and for the first time, I was grateful for anonymity. By the time I reached the Moretti estate, the gates had already opened for me, my men standing rigid in the rain, eyes down, guns hidden but ready. The world outside didn't know it, but I ruled this city from behind those iron gates, not through politics or press, but through blood and fear. The house itself was a fortress, sprawling, cold, built of stone and secrets, and every corner whispered of the lives I had taken to keep it standing. Matteo was waiting for me in the study when I entered, a glass of scotch in one hand, the faint scar on his cheek catching the firelight. "You're late," he said, his tone cautious. I didn't answer. I poured myself a drink instead, the ice clinking softly against the crystal, and sank into the leather chair behind my desk. The fire crackled, the rain drummed on the windows, and still, her laughter lingered in my mind. "You went to the docks tonight?" Matteo asked. I shook my head. "A cafe." He blinked, caught off guard. "A cafe?" "Yeah." He stared at me like I'd lost my mind. "You haven't stepped foot in public for 2 years, Dante. Not since—" "Don't." My voice came out sharper than I intended, cutting him off before he could say his name. Luca. My brother. My blood. My failure. The silence stretched. Matteo nodded once, lowering his gaze. "All right. So, what happened at this cafe that made you forget your usual paranoia?" I should have told him it was nothing. I should have said I was simply watching, blending in, gathering information. Any lie would have done. But instead I found myself saying, almost absently, "She made me laugh." Matteo froze. Then he set his glass down slowly. "She." "A waitress, clumsy, mouth like a knife." I took another drink, feeling ridiculous for even saying it aloud. She spilled coffee on me, then insulted me. For a moment he looked like he was waiting for the punchline. Then his expression shifted. Confusion, then disbelief, then something close to alarm. "You're serious?" I didn't answer. He sighed, rubbing his temple. "Dante, I don't know what the hell's gotten into you, but this isn't wise. You know better than anyone. Attachments make you weak." I leaned back, watching the flames dance in the fireplace. Maybe I'm tired of being strong. That made him pause. Matteo had been with me long enough to know when not to push. Still, he muttered, "If you're thinking of seeing her again, don't. Keep her out of this world. People like her don't survive it." I didn't respond because I already knew he was right. The last woman who'd stepped too close to my life hadn't survived it either, and her blood still haunted my dreams. But knowing what was right had never stopped me from doing what I wanted. Later, that night, I stood on the balcony, cigarette in hand, watching the city sprawl beneath me like a living, breathing organism, glittering, restless, cruel. Somewhere down there, she was sleeping, probably dreaming of anything but me, and yet I couldn't shake the thought of her smile. It wasn't just her beauty, though she had that quiet kind of beauty that doesn't beg to be noticed. It was her honesty, her unfiltered fire, the way she had looked at me and seen a man instead of a monster. People say the devil doesn't crave heaven, but I think that's a lie. I think he craves it desperately, knowing he can never belong there. And she, whether she knew it or not, was my heaven. The next morning, I sent one of my men, Lorenzo, to find out everything about her. He returned by noon, holding a slim file. "Aria Sullivan," he said, placing it on my desk. 26. Lives alone in a rundown apartment in the East Quarter. Works at that cafe on 5th and Green. No criminal record. No family nearby. Struggling artist. Nothing unusual. Nothing unusual. I opened the file anyway. Her picture, a grainy ID photo, stared back at me, and something in my chest tightened. She didn't belong in my world, not even a little, which was precisely why I couldn't stop thinking about her. "Keep an eye on her," I said. Lorenzo frowned. "For protection?" "Call it that." He hesitated. "Does she know who you are?" "No," I said quietly, "and she won't." That night, as I sat in my office surrounded by ledgers, deals, and death, the absurdity of it all struck me. I had enemies plotting against me, alliances to maintain, blood debts to collect. And yet my thoughts were consumed by a woman who probably couldn't afford her rent. I should have buried the memory of her under all the noise of this life. But instead, it had become the only sound I wanted to hear. It was madness. And I, of all people, knew how dangerous madness could be. Matteo came in later with a report. A Romano shipment gone missing near the docks, likely a provocation. "They're testing you," he said grimly. "They think you've gone soft." I smiled faintly. Let them think that. But when I walked into that warehouse an hour later, and the first bullet cracked the air, I remembered exactly who I was. The laughter, the softness, the light. All of it burned away under the weight of instinct. I moved like I'd been born in violence. And maybe I had. Gunfire, shouting, blood hitting the floor like rain. When it was over, I stood among the bodies, heart steady, hands stained red. The men waited for orders. I gave them none. I didn't need to. They knew what would come next. But even as I stood there, surrounded by death, all I could think of was how, when she'd looked at me, she hadn't seen this. She hadn't seen a killer, a crime lord, a devil in a $1,000 suit. She'd seen a man with coffee on his coat. And for one fragile, stolen moment, I had been exactly that. When I got back to the mansion, the blood still drying on my hands, I found another report on my desk. From Lorenzo. 2 lines, written in his careful hand. Subject followed safely to apartment. Attacked by mugger near alley. Intervened. She's fine. I froze, the paper crumpling slightly in my grip. She was already in danger, and not because of me. Not yet. But she would be. Because once a woman like that walks into your darkness and makes you remember the light, the world will do everything in its power to snuff her out. And I would burn it all before I let that happen. It started with the envelope. For days I told myself I wouldn't touch it, that I'd toss it away, burn it, pretend it never existed. But it sat there on my kitchen table like some kind of quiet accusation, reminding me of the night I'd made a stranger laugh. The thin paper glowed under the cheap yellow light of my apartment, mocking me with the way it refused to disappear, no matter how many times I told myself I didn't care. It was ridiculous, really, that something so small could feel so heavy, so alive, as though it carried not just money but meaning. And maybe that was what scared me most. I tried to ignore it. I threw myself into sketches that didn't work, ideas that wouldn't come together, coffee shifts that bled into one another until the nights and days blurred. But no matter what I did, my mind kept drifting back to him. The stranger with the scar near his temple. The one who'd looked at me like I was something he couldn't name. I told myself it was curiosity, nothing more, that it wasn't attraction or fascination or anything dangerous like that. But curiosity can be a slow poison when it starts to taste like hunger. By the 4th day, I snapped. It was raining again. Because of course it was. As if the universe was addicted to metaphors. And I was running late for my shift, half drenched by the time I pushed through the cafe doors. The place smelled like cinnamon and wet pavement. The radio humming softly. The same small crowd huddled near their laptops and lattes. Everything looked ordinary, unchanged. But I wasn't. Something inside me had shifted since that night. Like I'd opened a door I didn't know was there and couldn't close it again. "Morning, Arya," Lisa called from behind the counter, her voice far too chipper for 7 a.m. "Morning," I said, trying to sound normal, trying not to think about the envelope sitting in my bag like a ticking bomb. I had planned to give it back if he showed up again. That was the truth. I didn't want his money, didn't need his pity. And more than that, I wanted to look him in the eye and prove that whatever moment we'd shared wasn't for sale. But he didn't come. Not that day, not the next week. By the second week, I'd almost convinced myself he was a figment of my imagination. Some strange fever dream conjured by exhaustion and too many double shifts. But then, the little things started happening. First, it was the man across the street, standing by the newspaper stand, pretending to read but never turning a page. Then it was the same black car parked near the corner every night when I walked home. Once, I caught sight of someone in the driver's seat, eyes hidden behind dark glasses even though it was well past midnight. I told myself I was being paranoid, because who the hell would bother following me, a broke waitress who couldn't even afford a functioning heater? But deep down, I knew. And knowing scared me more than the idea of being wrong. Still, life had to go on, and pretending was easier than believing I'd somehow caught the attention of someone dangerous. I kept working, sketching on napkins during slow hours, ignoring the gnawing feeling that my life was no longer entirely my own. Then one evening, as the sun was bleeding into the skyline and the cafe was nearly empty, the bell over the door chimed. That same soft, familiar sound that had started everything. He was standing there. Same tailored suit, same dark eyes, same unsettling calm that made the air feel heavier just from his presence. The cafe went quiet again, just like last time, as if everyone instinctively knew there was something different about him. Something untouchable. He looked at me, and for a heartbeat, I forgot how to move. "Arya," he said, like it was a secret. My heart stuttered. You came back." "I told you I would." His voice carried the same quiet authority, but there was something gentler beneath it this time. A flicker of warmth that didn't belong in a man like him. I crossed my arms, pretending not to notice how my hands trembled. "You left something behind." He tilted his head slightly. "Did I?" I reached into my bag, pulled out the envelope and set it on the counter between us. "I don't want your money." For a long moment he said nothing. Then he smiled, faintly, like the idea of someone refusing him was almost amusing. "It wasn't about money." "Then what was it about?" He leaned in just slightly, enough for me to catch the scent of smoke and cedar that seemed to cling to him like a second skin. "A thank you," he said softly, "for reminding me I'm still capable of feeling something." His words should have sounded like a line, but they didn't. They sounded raw, almost painful, like confession disguised as charm. I wanted to tell him that I didn't want to be anyone's redemption, that I had my own chaos to survive. But instead, I found myself asking, "Who are you, really?" He smiled, and the answer in his eyes wasn't one he was willing to give. "Someone who doesn't belong here." Then as quickly as he came, he left again, leaving me standing there with my pulse thrumming in my throat and 1,000 unspoken questions burning on my tongue. After he walked out, I told myself that was the end, that I'd done what I needed to do, returned what wasn't mine, and now I could move on. But the truth is, you can't return something intangible. He'd taken my curiosity, my peace, my sense of normalcy, and those things don't come in envelopes. Later that night, I walked home through the drizzle, the city lights reflecting in puddles like melted stars, my breath turning white in the cold air. I was almost at my building when I heard it. Footsteps behind me, too deliberate, too close. My heart jumped. I turned, saw a figure in a hooded jacket, face obscured, moving fast. "Hey!" I called, though my voice wavered. No answer. I started walking faster. The sound of his steps quickened to match mine. The street was empty. The kind of empty that feels wrong, like silence before a scream. My fingers tightened around my keys, ready to use them as a weapon if I had to, my pulse roaring in my ears. I could feel him closing in, could hear the scuff of his boots against the wet pavement. Then a shadow moved out of nowhere. A hand shot out, grabbed the man by the collar, slammed him against the wall with such force that the sound cracked through the alley. I froze, unable to breathe as my attacker crumpled to the ground. The man who'd saved me turned slowly, the dim streetlight catching the sharp angles of his face. Him. The stranger. Dante. For the first time, I saw something in his eyes that wasn't calm or controlled. It was fury, raw and consuming, the kind that came from somewhere deeper than instinct. He looked at the unconscious man, then back at me, his jaw tight, his voice dangerously quiet. "Are you hurt?" I shook my head, still too shocked to speak. He stepped closer, his expression softening slightly as his hand brushed a strand of wet hair from my face. "You shouldn't walk alone at night," he said, and though his tone was almost gentle, there was a possessiveness in it that made my chest tighten. "How did you—" I started, but he was already walking away, his coat dark against the rain. "Get inside, Arya," he said without turning back, "and lock the door." I watched him disappear into the shadows, my breath fogging in the cold air, my body trembling from adrenaline, and something else I didn't want to name. He had saved me. But how did he know where I'd be? And why did it feel like being rescued was somehow the most dangerous thing that had ever happened to me? As I closed the door behind me that night, the question wouldn't stop echoing in my mind. Not who he was, but what he was. Because deep down, I already knew the truth. No ordinary man moved like that. No ordinary man carried that kind of danger in his silence. And I had a feeling that whatever world Dante Moretti belonged to, I had just stepped into it without realizing I'd crossed a line I could never uncross. It had been years since I'd allowed something as unpredictable as emotion to dictate my actions, years since I had done anything that wasn't calculated, precise, or necessary. And yet there I was, standing on the edge of a rooftop under a slate-colored sky, watching her apartment from a distance as if I were some kind of ghost incapable of walking away from the living. The city stretched beneath me in shades of steel and gold, the rain glinting off the streetlights like veins of light running through the dark. And in that moment, I hated myself for the weakness she had awakened in me. Because I had built an empire on discipline, on silence, on ruthlessness, and now a single woman's laughter had made me reckless enough to care. Lorenzo stood behind me, silent as always, his gloved hands tucked neatly behind his back. He was a loyal man, efficient and discreet, and though he never questioned my orders aloud, I could feel the weight of his unspoken judgment hanging between us like fog. "You shouldn't be here," he said finally, his voice low, steady and cautious. I didn't answer. I just watched her light flicker on through her window, saw her move across the room, unaware, untouched, unguarded, and something inside me twisted painfully, because she had no idea that danger lived just beyond her walls, not from the petty thief who had tried to corner her in that alley, but from the very man who had saved her. When I finally spoke, my voice sounded foreign even to me. "Has she been followed since?" "No," Lorenzo replied. "We've kept her under watch. No threats. No contact." "Good," I said, though the word tasted hollow, because the truth was that the threat wasn't external anymore. It was me. After the alley, after seeing that bastard lay a hand on her, Something inside me had snapped in a way I hadn't thought possible anymore. I had killed before, too many times to count. And it had always been easy, almost mechanical, but that night, it wasn't business or strategy or duty that drove me. It was rage, pure, violent rage, the kind that comes when something precious is touched, when something fragile and undeserving of harm is threatened by the filth of the world. I'd left the man alive, barely, though every instinct in me had screamed to end him, because killing him would have raised questions that might lead back to her. And I couldn't risk that. Not yet. Back at the mansion, the night stretched long and merciless. I poured myself another drink, letting the burn of the whiskey remind me I was still made of flesh and blood, though most days I felt carved from something colder. Matteo entered without knocking, one of the few men allowed to. His expression was tight, the kind of look that said he'd been rehearsing what to say the whole way there. "You're making a mistake," he began, his tone softer than usual, like he was speaking to a man on the edge. "About what?" I asked, not looking up. "About her." I exhaled, slowly, swirling the drink in my hand. "You think I don't know what I'm doing?" "I think you're forgetting what happens when you care," he said, and for a moment I hated him for being right. "You've built this entire kingdom on fear, Dante. You've made men kneel by showing them you have nothing left to lose. The moment they sense weakness—" "She's not a weakness," I interrupted too sharply. "She's—" I trailed off, unable to find the word that didn't sound like madness. He waited, studying me with the kind of patience only a man who had buried too many friends could have. "She's a distraction, and distractions get people killed." I wanted to tell him to leave, to remind him that I didn't answer to anyone. But the truth was, Matteo had earned the right to speak freely. He had been there the night my brother's body was pulled from the river, his throat slit, his blood staining the water like spilled wine. He'd seen what grief had done to me, how it had hollowed me out, turned me from man to monster. He'd seen me laugh for the last time before that night, and he'd been there when I stopped. "Do you remember what Luca used to say?" Matteo continued quietly. "He said you'd never stop chasing ghosts. And maybe that's what this girl is. A ghost of the life you wanted before all of this." I closed my eyes, the sound of my brother's name slicing through me like a blade. Luca had been everything I wasn't: gentle, good, capable of love. He'd been the light in a family built on darkness, and when that light was extinguished, I'd decided the world didn't deserve mercy anymore. But when Arya had looked at me, when she'd made me laugh, for one brief, unguarded second, I'd felt that lost part of myself stir, the part I'd buried with him. Maybe Matteo was right. Maybe she was a ghost. But I wasn't ready to let her go. I stood, setting the glass down with deliberate calm. "Keep her safe," I said, discreetly. "No one touches her. No one even looks at her without my order." Matteo sighed. "And what do you plan to do with her, Dante? Keep her in a gilded cage like the rest of your possessions?" I didn't answer, because the truth was I didn't know. All I knew was that letting her walk away had already become impossible. The next few days passed in fragments. Meetings, negotiations, threats wrapped in pleasantries, the usual rhythm of empire maintenance. But it all felt muted, blurred by the constant gnawing awareness of her existence somewhere in the city. Every time I signed a contract or ordered a man's death, I thought of her hands, small, paint-stained, trembling as she handed me that envelope. Every time I heard laughter echoing through the hallways from my men, it reminded me of the sound that had come from her. Bright, disarming, alive. It was maddening, this intrusion of softness into a life built on sharp edges. By the end of the week, I told myself I would see her again, once, to convince myself that it was nothing, that she was just another fleeting distraction, like all the others. But the truth was I already knew I was lying. That night, Lorenzo came to me again. his expression grim. "There's been an attack," he said. My entire body went still. "Where?" "Warehouse on the east side. Romano's men. They hit the shipment. We lost 2. Anger flared like an old wound reopening. "And?" "They left a message." He handed me a slip of paper. A single line scrawled in red ink. "Even kings can bleed." I crushed the note in my hand. "Get everyone ready." Within an hour, I was standing in the wreckage, the smell of gunpowder thick in the air, the floor slick with blood. My men moved silently around me cleaning up, but all I saw were the bodies. The Romaros were pushing, testing, trying to see if grief had made me soft. It hadn't. If anything, it made me sharper. Still, as I walked through the chaos, one thought struck me like a knife. What if this wasn't about business? What if it was a warning? Not to me, but to her. The timing was too close, too precise. I left without a word, my pulse steady, my mind burning. By the time I reached the car, I already knew what I was going to do, even if it made me the devil everyone already believed I was. If the world wanted to use her to get to me, then I would remove her from it, protect her the only way I knew how. Not with distance, but with possession. Because men like me don't protect what we love by setting it free. We protect it by caging it from everything that could ever hurt it, including ourselves. And as I drove through the storm toward her apartment, I knew that by the time the night ended, she would no longer be just the girl who made me laugh. She would be the one thing I couldn't afford to lose, and the one thing I would never let go of again. The night he came to my door, the rain had been falling for hours, relentless and heavy. The kind of storm that made the city seem smaller, quieter, as though it were holding its breath. I remember sitting by the window, sketchbook open but untouched, staring at the streets below that shimmered like black glass under the flickering streetlights. The world outside felt distant, almost unreal. And for reasons I couldn't explain, my chest ached with the strange certainty that something was about to happen. Something I couldn't see but could somehow feel approaching like thunder rolling in from far away. When the knock came, it wasn't loud, but it carried weight. Deliberate, unhurried, a sound that didn't ask for permission but expected to be answered. For a long moment I just sat there, staring at the door, heart pounding in uneven rhythms. No one visited me. No one ever had reason to. Yet something in me already knew who it was, even before I rose to my feet, even before I saw the shadow through the peephole, tall and still, framed by rain. When I opened the door, the first thing I saw was the umbrella, black, sleek, dripping with water, and then him, standing there as if he had stepped out of another world entirely. Dante. His suit was dark as sin, perfectly pressed, his tie loosened slightly, his hair damp from the rain. The dim hallway light caught the hard lines of his jaw, the small scar near his temple, the eyes that watched me like they were cataloging every breath I took. Behind him, a car idled on the curb. Long, black, the kind of car that belonged to men you didn't say no to. "Aria," he said, my name rolling off his tongue like something familiar, almost tender, though his tone carried the weight of command beneath it. I swallowed hard, gripping the edge of the door. "How do you keep finding me?" He smiled faintly, but it wasn't the kind of smile that reached his eyes. It's not difficult when you know where to look. I wanted to ask him what that meant, how much he knew, how long he'd been watching me, but my throat tightened around the words. Instead, I asked, "What do you want?" "Dinner," he said simply, as if that one word explained everything. "Dinner?" I repeated, incredulous. "Yes." His gaze didn't waver. "Get dressed. Something elegant." I blinked, half certain I'd misheard him. "I'm not going anywhere with you." He took a slow step closer, the scent of him, smoke, cedar, and something darker, curling around me like invisible chains. "You're safe with me," he said, and the way he said it made it sound less like a promise and more like a declaration. Like safety itself was something he decided, not something I was allowed to feel. "Safe?" I whispered, though it came out as more of a challenge. "You show up at my door in the middle of the night and call that safe?" His expression softened, though his voice didn't lose its quiet authority. "You were attacked once. I won't let it happen again." "I didn't ask you to protect me," I shot back, but he only tilted his head slightly, like I was amusing him again, like I was some contradiction he couldn't quite solve. "Not yet," he said. And that should have been the end of it. I should have slammed the door, called someone, done anything other than what I did next. But something about him, about the gravity in his voice, the strange gentleness in his eyes despite the steel underneath, made me hesitate. There was danger in him, yes, but there was also certainty. And after a lifetime of chaos and uncertainty, maybe that was what made me step back, letting him into my world once more. He waited silently as I changed, into the only dress I owned that could remotely be called elegant, a simple black one with thin straps and a modest slit. When I emerged, his eyes lingered for a fraction too long, his expression unreadable. Then he extended his arm. "Shall we?" The car ride was quiet. The city, sliding past in streaks of gold and gray. I kept my gaze fixed on the window, pretending not to feel the weight of his presence beside me, pretending that the air between us wasn't charged with something dangerous and unspoken. I didn't know where we were going, and I didn't ask. Something told me that asking questions around Dante Moretti was like lighting matches in a room full of gasoline. When the car finally stopped, I looked up and realized we were outside a restaurant I had only ever seen in magazines. La Lumière, the kind of place that required reservations months in advance, where people whispered about deals made over candlelight and fortunes exchanged between courses. The valet opened my door, and as Dante stepped out beside me, every head near the entrance turned subtly, the way people do when they recognize power, even if they can't name it. Inside, the air was warm, perfumed with wine and roses, the lighting dim enough to feel intimate but bright enough to remind you of your place. The maitre d' bowed slightly, his eyes flicking nervously toward Dante before leading us to a private table in the corner. No menus were offered. Of course not. Dante didn't need to choose. The world arranged itself around him. For a while, neither of us spoke. He watched me with quiet intensity, and I tried not to squirm beneath it. When the waiter poured the wine, Dante lifted his glass slightly. "To bravery," he said. I arched a brow. "Whose?" "Yours." I didn't know whether to be flattered or afraid. "You think showing up here with you makes me brave?" He smiled faintly. "No. I think talking back to me does." I took a slow sip of wine, letting the heat of it slide down my throat. "You still haven't told me who you are." He leaned back, studying me with that same measured calm that always felt half like admiration, half like a warning. "Would it make a difference if I did?" "Yes," I said. "I'd know whether I should be here." He looked at me for a long time, the silence stretching until it became a thing of its own, heavy and fragile. Finally, he said, "You shouldn't." The honesty in his voice startled me. "Then why invite me?" His eyes flickered, something dark passing through them. "Because I wanted to see you again." There was a vulnerability in his words that unsettled me more than any threat could have. He wasn't trying to charm me. I could tell. He was confessing something, though whether it was desire or danger, I couldn't tell. The dinner passed in a strange blur of contradictions, laughter and tension, warmth and distance. He spoke little about himself, but the way people looked at him, the way waiters bowed just a little too deeply, told me more than words ever could. He was someone important. Someone feared. When the plates were cleared and the rain had softened outside, he He stood and held out his hand to me. "Come," he said. I hesitated. "Where?" "Outside." We stepped out into the damp night, the air cool against my skin. The city lights reflected in the puddles like broken constellations. Dante stopped near the curb, his expression unreadable, his voice low. "Aria," he said softly, as if testing the name again, like it tasted better every time. "You shouldn't trust me." I met his gaze, heart pounding, the weight of his words sinking deep into me. "Then why are you telling me this?" "Because," he said, stepping closer, his breath brushing against my ear, "you already do." Before I could reply, before I could think or breathe, he pressed his lips lightly against my cheek. Not a kiss, not really, but a promise, a warning, and a goodbye all at once. Then he turned, and the car door opened for him, as if the night itself obeyed his command. I stood there trembling, watching the taillights disappear into the rain, every nerve in my body alive with confusion and fear, and something dangerously close to longing. He'd told me not to trust him, and somehow that made me want to know him even more. And deep down, beneath the part of me that still believed in safety and reason, something whispered that I wasn't standing on solid ground anymore. I was already falling, and the worst part was, I wasn't sure I wanted to stop. There are moments in a man's life when time bends, when everything he has built, every decision, every boundary, every wall erected to keep the world at bay, begins to crack under the weight of something he cannot name. And as I stood outside La Lumière that night, watching her walk away beneath the rain, her silhouette fragile against the wet glow of the city, I realized with a kind of quiet dread that I had already crossed the point of no return, that I had let her into the one place no one had ever been allowed to reach. My weakness, my hunger, my heart that I had thought long dead. The drive back to the estate should have been uneventful, just another routine return to a fortress of marble and security cameras. But something in the air felt wrong. A tension I could not define, the kind that prickles beneath the skin like static before lightning strikes. Lorenzo was driving, his eyes flicking to the rearview mirror too often, his jaw tight. "Something you want to tell me?" I asked, my tone flat, though I already knew the answer. "There was chatter," he said carefully. "Romano's men. They know you've been seen with a woman. They think she's important." I felt the shift in my chest before my expression changed, a slow, controlled fury that settled like ice in my veins. "They wouldn't dare," I said, but even as the words left my mouth, I knew they already had. In my world, love, or even the suggestion of it, wasn't a gift, it was a weapon. And Aria, innocent and unguarded, had just become the most valuable target in the city. When we reached the mansion, Matteo was waiting in the foyer, his shirt, half unbuttoned, gun tucked into his waistband, the faint smell of gun oil and tension filling the space between us. "You need to see this," he said without preamble, and I followed him into my study where the screens glowed with live feeds from every corner of the city, streets, warehouses, alleys, until one of them caught my eye. The cafe, empty now, lights off, doors locked. But the feed wasn't from inside, it was from across the street, grainy, the angle tilted slightly upward, capturing the window of Aria's small apartment above. She was there, moving in her living room, unaware that anyone was watching. My hands curled into fists. "Who the hell took this?" "One of Romano's men," Matteo said grimly. "We intercepted it before it reached him. They've been watching her." The room fell into silence, so thick it felt like another presence. I stared at the screen until the image burned into my mind. The gentle way she brushed her hair from her face, the way her lips moved as she hummed some quiet tune to herself. She had no idea what kind of storm she had wandered into. I turned away from the monitor, my voice low, deliberate. Send the cars. No one touches her. No one gets within 10 blocks of that building unless it's one of ours. Matteo hesitated. Dante? Do it, I snapped, the old fire in my tone cutting through any room for argument. Within minutes, the house exploded into motion. Men armed and ready, engines roaring in the courtyard, radios crackling with codes and confirmations. And in the chaos, in that strange rhythm of violence that had always come as easily to me as breathing, I realized how much she had already changed me. Before her, this would have been business. Now it was personal. When we reached her street, the world seemed to hold its breath again. The rain had stopped, but the air was heavy, thick with the promise of something about to go wrong. Lorenzo's voice came through the earpiece. 2 men near the building entrance, armed, they're waiting. Take them, I said. The shots were muffled, precise, 2 quick bursts, then silence. I was out of the car before the bodies hit the ground, moving fast, gun drawn, boots echoing against the wet pavement. The building smelled like damp brick and old paint. And somewhere above, a floorboard creaked, the faint sound of life. Hers. I climbed the stairs quietly, every instinct sharpened, and when I reached her door, I didn't knock. I kicked it open. She was standing in the middle of the room, barefoot, startled, her sketchbook tumbling from her hands to the floor. Dante, what? Down! I ordered, crossing the room in seconds. Now! Her eyes widened at the sight of the gun in my hand. What the hell are you doing? Saving your life, I said, scanning the windows, the shadows, every corner where death might be hiding. She flinched at the word, her voice breaking. You're scaring me. I should, I muttered, moving to the window and yanking the curtain aside just in time to see a flash of light across the street. The faint gleam of a rifle barrel. I pulled her down, covering her with my body as the glass shattered, bullets ripping through the air where she had been standing seconds before. Her scream was swallowed by the deafening crack of gunfire, and for one wild, furious heartbeat, all I could think about was how fragile she felt beneath me, how small her world was compared to the monsters who wanted to destroy it. The shooting stopped as suddenly as it had started. Somewhere outside, engines roared, tires screeched, shouts echoed, and then silence again. I stood, scanning the street one last time before turning back to her. She was trembling, her hands shaking as she tried to steady her breath, her eyes darting between me and the gun still in my hand. Are you hurt? I asked. No, she whispered, her voice hoarse. But I think you owe me an explanation. I holstered the weapon, exhaling slowly, the adrenaline still humming beneath my skin. You were being watched. They were planning to take you. Take me? She repeated, disbelief twisting her words. Why? Who would? Because of me. The truth hung there like smoke, dark and impossible to ignore. She stared at me, confusion giving way to realization, to horror. Who are you, Dante? She asked again, the same question she'd asked at dinner. But this time, there was no softness in it. For a moment, I almost lied. It would have been easy. A half-truth. Something to keep her safe from the full weight of what I was. But the look in her eyes, raw, searching, unafraid, demanded honesty, even if it ruined everything. I run things in this city, I said quietly. Things you don't want to know about. Things that keep men like the ones who came for you from walking away alive. She took a step back, shaking her head. You're, what, some kind of criminal? I smiled faintly without humor. That's a generous word for it. She didn't move, didn't speak, just looked at me with a mixture of fear and disbelief, and something that cut deeper than either. Betrayal. And all this time you, what, followed me, watched me, protected me? Yes. Why? Her voice broke on the word. Why me? I hesitated, and for once I didn't have a practiced answer. No elegant lie to fall back on. Because you made me remember what it felt like to be human. I said, my voice low. And I don't know how to stop wanting that. Her eyes filled with tears, though she didn't let them fall. You killed those men, didn't you? Yes. Do you even feel anything when you do that? I took a slow breath, stepped closer. Only when it's someone who tries to hurt what's mine. The silence that followed was suffocating. She looked at me then, really looked, as if seeing for the first time what I truly was, not the man in the tailored suit, not the stranger who laughed, but the devil who'd built his kingdom out of blood and regret. And then, before I could stop myself, I reached for her, one hand cupping her jaw, thumb brushing the edge of her trembling mouth. You're safe now, I whispered, though I knew it was a lie. Am I? She asked, her voice barely audible. I didn't answer. I just leaned forward and kissed her. It wasn't gentle. It wasn't kind. It was desperate, violent with restraint, a collision of everything I shouldn't feel and everything I couldn't deny. For a moment, the world vanished. No guns, no enemies, no empire, only her breath against mine and the taste of rain on her lips. When I pulled back, her eyes were wide, her pulse racing beneath my fingertips. What happens now? She whispered. I looked at the shattered window, the blood outside, the darkness pressing in around us. Now, I said quietly, I make sure they never come near you again. Her voice trembled. And if I don't want your protection? Then you'll still have it, I said. And in that moment I realized that no matter how much she feared me, no matter how much I wanted to keep her untouched by this world, the truth was already written in blood. Because what I felt for her was no longer a choice, no longer something I could contain or reason with. She had become my reason, my obsession, my undoing. And I knew, even then, that the next time someone came for her, I wouldn't just kill to protect her. I would burn the whole city to the ground. The days after the shooting felt like walking through water, each movement slowed by an invisible current that pulled at me from inside. And though my body performed the motions of living, going to work, making coffee, answering the polite, pitying questions from people who thought I'd been through something scarring but survivable, my head was a riot of images that didn't belong to ordinary life. The flash of a rifle across a rainy street, the wet thud of a body hitting pavement, Dante's hands on me as if he were anchoring me to the world, the violent press of his lips against mine that had tasted of rain and something older and infinitely more dangerous. And when I tried to pin down what any of it meant, besides a dangerous man inserting himself into my life where he had no right, the only answer that rose up was the simple, terrifying fact that I had been given the key to a door I had never wanted opened. And once a door like that swings inward, the house of your life changes its shape, and you can never get the same room back. I told myself, fiercely and often, that I would not let him define me, that I would not be the woman who accepted protection like a badge pinned to her ribs, and whose future was negotiated in the margins of someone else's ledger. And for the first 2 days, I kept the envelope of cash hidden in the back of my drawer like contraband, refusing to touch it, refusing to accept the implicit exchange it represented. But then the world turned the page for me in a way I could not have anticipated when a headline flashed across the bottom of my phone screen while I was wiping down tables at the cafe. A headline that felt like a match tossed into dry linen. Dante Moretti, city's elusive kingpin linked to latest warehouse massacre, and beneath it, a dozen other pieces that stitched together into an outline of a life I had only glimpsed in half-truths and late-night glances. Men in suits with faces like stone, photographers staking out quiet streets, an old photo of Dante at a funeral where the angles made him look younger and softer, and the reporters, with their sharp teeth and their hunger for scandal, sowing narratives about blood and power and the price of living in a city that had long ago decided to bow to whoever could make the most people fear them. I read the article 3 times, fingers gripping the laminated edge of the counter until the knuckles whitened, because the words were a kind of violence of their own, the polite euphemisms, and the carefully sourced allegations that all led to the same unmistakable truth. The man who had laughed in the cafe, the man who had kissed me and called me brave and who had somehow saved my life in an alley, was not merely dangerous in the general romance novel sense. He was dangerous in the most literal, irrevocable way. The way that rearranged your options and stole your illusions, and the knowledge of who Dante Moretti truly was burned through me like acid, dissolving the naive comfort I had tried to keep intact by pretending ignorance was safety. When I finally left my shift that night, the air outside felt as if it had been scrubbed clean of any possibility of ordinary magic. The sky was a blank slate, the streetlights like small suns in a city that had no star to call its own, and I walked faster than usual because speed felt like a remedy for panic. But speed could not outrun the feeling of being observed, the sense that 1,000 small eyes had turned toward me and were cataloging my gait, my jacket, the way I crossed my shoulders like someone trying to become smaller and therefore less interesting. By the time I reached my block, my phone vibrated in my pocket with a message from an unknown number. Just 4 words and nothing more. "We're watching you." And the hair at the back of my neck stood up so hard, it felt like the beginning of winter inside my skin. I'm not proud of what I did next, though I can describe it with a clarity that feels almost clinical in the aftermath. The kind of clarity that people get when shock turns memory into a map. I tried to leave, packed a single bag with the essentials, some cash, a couple of dresses, the sketchbook I never left behind. And when I reached the front of my building, intending to take a taxi to the only friend who would let me sleep on her couch without asking questions, the door to my apartment flew open before I could think, and 3 men I did not know blocked the threshold, their faces obscured by balaclavas and the metallic scent of intention ringing in the air like a promise. My mouth dried. I wanted to scream, to throw my bag at them and run down the stairs and out into whatever anonymity the night could give me. But the moment stretched, and the calculation ran through my spine like a cold algorithm. One wrong move, and I might not be leaving at all. And in that ticking infinity, my training in caution, learned from a childhood of not being seen, and from being a woman who had learned to make herself scarce for survival, convinced me to play for time, to speak, to stall, to find some small aperture through which I could collapse the situation into something salvageable. "Who are you?" I asked, the question as blunt as a knife and as useless as a prayer, because their silence answered everything. And then from the stairwell a shadow moved, and the voice that followed it was not anonymous, but all the more terrifying for its calm. A voice that carried with it the authority of someone who could make decisions about life and death without blinking. Aria Sullivan. The name sounded like an invocation, and he stepped forward as if the room were all his stage. And for the first time since I'd met him, the panic that had been a constant drumbeat in my chest eased into a different, more complicated feeling. Because standing at the head of those men, with his coat still dripping from rain and his hair slightly mussed where the night had touched him, was Dante. And the way he looked at me was not possessive in the crude sense I had feared, nor tender in the naive way my heart wanted. Instead, it was an expression folded from every harsh thing I had heard about him, and every gentler, secret thing he had shown me. And the men at his side relaxed, as if a command had been issued in the only language they truly understood. He walked over to me, his hand brushing the air between us, as though to make certain I was real. And when he spoke, his voice was low, a murmur that seemed to vibrate in my bones rather than simply entering my ears. "You shouldn't have tried to leave." There was accusation in the sentence, soft and raw, and a fierce, dangerous care that I could feel like heat. I wanted to answer, to tell him I didn't want whatever he had to offer, that I would rather sleep on a cold bench than be wrapped in silk and blood. But the words died on my tongue because the men who had come to take me looked suddenly small and foolish in the presence of the man who could make them disappear with a single look. And in that crowded, impossible hallway I tasted something I could not name, and that shamed me with its pull. He reached out and took my bag with the same casualness one might use to move an object of no consequence. And as he handed it back to me, his eyes met mine with a gravity that made the air between us dense and slippery. And he said simply, firmly, "Come with me. It's not safe here." There were 1,000 reasons to refuse him, to slam the door and call the police and tear the fragile thread that had attached me to him like a bandage over an old wound. But there was only one reason I moved. The part of me that had already been softened by his laughter and steadied by his hands when bullets had riddled the air. The part of me that, though it trembled and wanted to be free, could not deny how utterly exhausted I was from pretending that fear was something I could outpace. And so, like a moth that keeps forgetting the burn, I let him lead me down the hall, out into the night, past a waiting car whose windows hid the shape of other men. And as the door shut behind us, the city seemed to fold into silence, which was both mercy and indictment, because stepping into his world meant I had already lost the chance to return to the life I'd known before he laughed. And I understood then, with a clarity that was almost cruel, that the truth had burned away what was left of my illusions, and had left me with the stark knowledge that whatever choice I made next would not simply be about survival, but about whether I would live under his protection or under his power. And either way, there would be no easy escape. I climbed into the car without resistance, and as the door closed and the engine hummed to life, I watched my old life shrink in the rearview mirror until it was nothing but a smear of light. And somewhere behind the steady beat of my own pulse, a question burned brighter than any other. If I let him keep me safe, what, and who, would I have to become? The drive to the estate was long, the kind of drive that gives a man too much time to think. And thinking, in my experience, has always been more dangerous than bleeding. The night outside was a dark river of motion, lights sliding by like ghosts that didn't care where we were going. And in the back seat, Arya sat with her arms wrapped around herself, silent but not broken, staring out the window as if the city might reach out and pull her back if she looked hard enough. I watched her reflection in the glass, her eyes wide, jaw tight, shoulders drawn inward. And though I knew she hated me for bringing her into my world, I couldn't let her go. Hate, after all, could be survived. Loss couldn't. The car's interior smelled faintly of leather and rain. Matteo was driving, Lorenzo beside him, the only two men I trusted enough to keep close when she was near. They didn't speak, didn't dare to. And that silence, that perfect, disciplined quiet, was the kind of peace I understood best. But her silence was different. Hers was heavy, alive, made of all the words she wasn't saying, all the questions she'd swallowed because she already suspected the answers would ruin something inside her. "You're angry," I said finally, not because I needed to hear. It confirmed, but because I needed to hear her voice again. She didn't look at me. "I'm terrified." Her honesty hit harder than any accusation. I could have lied to her, could have promised safety and normalcy, could have told her that everything would be fine. But the truth was, nothing about me had ever been fine. I didn't know how to build peace. I only knew how to win wars. "You're safe now," I said anyway, though even as the words left my mouth, they tasted like betrayal. She turned then, her gaze sharp in the dim light. "You keep saying that," she whispered, "but the only time I've ever felt unsafe was when you're near." Her words cut deeper than she knew, but I didn't flinch. "That's because you don't understand what's out there," I said softly. "If you did, you'd realize I'm the only thing keeping it from reaching you. And what if the thing I'm scared of is you?" There it was, the truth she had been holding in, the one that hung between us like smoke. I didn't respond, because I couldn't. Anything I said would have been a lie. She was right to fear me. The men who had raised me, the blood I carried, the empire that whispered my name like a curse, none of it could coexist with someone like her. The car rolled through the gates of my estate, the iron and stone parting with mechanical precision. The driveway curved upward through tall pines, and the mansion came into view, its lights soft and gold against the black sky. It wasn't a home. It was a monument to power, built on silence and control. I saw her reaction in the reflection, the way her lips parted, not in awe, but in disbelief. "This is where you live?" she asked quietly. "Yes." "It feels like a prison." "It is," I said, "just one with nicer furniture." When the car stopped, I stepped out first, the gravel crunching under my shoes, then turned to help her out. She hesitated before taking my hand, and the contact, brief, reluctant, electric, sent something sharp and unwelcome through me. I wanted to pull her closer, to tell her that none of this was supposed to happen, that she had somehow stepped into a story that even I didn't know how to control anymore. But I didn't. I led her inside instead. The house was quiet except for the faint ticking of the clock in the hall and the echo of our footsteps on marble. Paintings lined the walls, Italian masters, Renaissance saints with sorrow in their eyes. And for the first time, I wondered what she saw when she looked at all of it. Did she see power or loneliness? I couldn't tell anymore. Matteo appeared at the top of the stairs. "The guest room is ready," he said, then paused, eyes flicking toward Arya before landing back on me. "Anything else?" "No." He nodded and disappeared. The moment he was gone, I turned back to her. She hadn't moved, still standing at the bottom of the stairs, her coat dripping onto the marble, her expression unreadable. "Come upstairs," I said. "I don't want to," she replied. Something about her defiance made me want to laugh, and maybe that was the most dangerous part. That even now, even in the middle of all this darkness, she could still stir something human in me. "You'll want to change," I said. "You're freezing." "Don't tell me what I want," she said quietly, and that soft rebellion made something tighten in my chest. I stepped closer, slowly, until the space between us was small enough for me to see the tremor in her breath. "I'm not your enemy, Arya." "Then what are you?" Her question lingered like a wound. I wanted to tell her that I didn't know anymore, that once upon a time I had been a brother, a son, a man who could laugh without guilt, but that all of those versions of me had died the night my brother did. Instead, I said, "I'm the one who will keep you alive." She stared at me for a long time, as if searching for something behind the words, some sign that there was still a man buried beneath the violence. Maybe she saw it. Maybe she didn't. But eventually, she followed me up the stairs. The room I gave her was large, elegant, untouched by time. The windows overlooked the courtyard, where the rain had softened into mist. I left her there, standing in the middle of the room, her reflection framed by moonlight. And when I closed the door behind me, I stayed there on the other side longer than I should have, listening to the faint sound of her movement, the whisper of fabric, the hesitant creak of the floorboards, until it stopped, and silence filled the hall again. Later, in my office, Matteo found me staring at the wall. "You brought her here," he said, not a question. "Yes." He sighed, rubbing the bridge of his nose. "You can't keep her locked away, Dante. She's not one of us." "I know." "She doesn't belong here." "I know that too." "Then why?" I poured a glass of whiskey and stared at the amber liquid. "Because the world won't stop until it destroys everything pure. And she's the only pure thing I've seen in years." Matteo didn't answer. He didn't have to. He'd seen me lose control before, not in the way of anger, but in the way of obsession, of a man who mistakes beauty for salvation. When he left, I sat in the dim light until I couldn't tell whether I was protecting her from the world or from myself. Hours passed before I went back upstairs. The house was asleep. The halls dark. I paused outside her door, listening again. There was no sound. I should have turned away, Should have gone back to my room and forced sleep to drown the thoughts clawing at my mind. But something stronger than reason pulled me forward. I opened the door quietly. She was awake, sitting by the window in one of my shirts, the fabric hanging loosely from her shoulders. The moonlight touched her hair, turning it to silver. She didn't look surprised to see me. "Couldn't sleep either?" she asked softly. "No," I said. "I don't sleep much." She looked at me then, really looked, and for the first time she didn't seem afraid. "You said this house was a prison," she murmured. "Who's keeping you here, Dante?" Her question hit me harder than any bullet ever could, because she didn't ask it like an accusation. She asked it like she already knew the answer. I took a step toward her, then another, until the space between us was thin as breath. "Maybe I built the walls myself," I said. "And now you're building mine," she whispered. Her words tore through me, but I didn't deny them. I couldn't. Because she was right. Every act of protection was also an act of possession, and I had crossed that line the moment I brought her here. Still, I couldn't make myself leave. I reached out, brushed a lock of hair from her face, and said, "If you hate me tomorrow, I'll let you go." "Will you?" she asked, and the way she said it, soft, almost tender, told me she already knew I was lying. I didn't answer. I just stood there, watching the moon fade behind the clouds, knowing that whatever came next would destroy us both in ways neither of us could yet imagine. And for the first time in years, I felt something close to peace, the kind that comes right before the world begins to burn. It's strange how quickly fear can become routine, how the sharp edge of terror dulls into something like acceptance when you've been living in its shadow long enough. And in the days that followed my arrival at Dante's estate, I learned the rhythm of his world, the quiet murmurs of men in dark suits who spoke in coded phrases and half-truths, the heavy footsteps that passed my door at night, the faint echo of gunfire carried by the wind from somewhere too far to see, but close enough to know it was real. The walls of his mansion were beautiful, marble and gold, but I had begun to understand that beauty was just another weapon in his arsenal, a way to disguise the prison he'd built for himself, and now, for me. He kept me safe, that much was true, but safety had never felt so claustrophobic, so loud in its silence. I had everything I could possibly want: warmth, food, art supplies, books, but none of it mattered, because what I wanted was the one thing he couldn't give me: freedom. And yet, when he walked into a room, the air itself seemed to rearrange around him, and every instinct that screamed for me to run was silenced by something deeper, something I hated myself for recognizing. Desire, not the soft kind, but the dangerous kind that binds you to the very person who could destroy you. One night, I found him in his study, sitting in the half-light of the fireplace, a glass of whiskey in one hand, his other hand resting on an open ledger filled with neat columns of numbers that I knew weren't from any legitimate business. He looked up when I entered, and though I wanted to say something sharp, something that would remind him I wasn't one of his possessions, all that came out was a whisper. "You don't sleep." He smiled faintly, a tired, dangerous smile that didn't reach his eyes. "I can't afford to." The room smelled of smoke and secrets, and the flames painted his face in shades of gold and shadow. I walked closer despite myself, drawn to the contradiction of him, the man who could order someone's death with the same calm he used to ask me how my day was. "You think keeping me here will make you sleep better?" He didn't answer immediately, and when he did, his voice was low, rough, and unguarded. "It's not about sleep, Arya. It's about not losing the one thing I didn't know I still needed." For a moment, the words hung between us, soft and heavy, and then he looked away, his jaw tightening as though he regretted saying them. I wanted to tell him that what he was feeling wasn't love. It was guilt, obsession, maybe even redemption masquerading as affection. But the truth was, part of me didn't want to be right. It was the next morning when everything began to unravel. The sky was gray, the air thick with the promise of rain, and I was standing on the balcony outside my room when I noticed something strange. A black car parked at the edge of the woods, half hidden among the trees. It had been there yesterday too, I realized, but I hadn't paid attention then. I watched for a long moment, the back of my neck prickling, and then, just as I was about to turn away, the driver's door opened and a man stepped out. He looked up, directly at me. And in that instant, I knew two things with terrible certainty. First, that whoever he was, he didn't belong here. And second, that he knew I wasn't supposed to be here either. By the time I turned to find Dante, he was already gone from his study, the entire house humming with unease. Voices echoed through the halls, clipped and urgent, and I caught fragments of sentences. They've breached the line, the Romaros know. Someone talked. The words hit me like a slap. Someone had betrayed him. I found him in the courtyard, surrounded by his men, his expression carved from ice. He was giving orders, each one short and final, his voice steady in a way that terrified me more than if he'd shouted. When he saw me, something flickered behind his composure. Relief, maybe. But he didn't stop what he was doing. "What's happening?" I asked, though I already knew. "Get back inside," he said. "Not until you tell me." He exhaled, slow and sharp. "Romano's men are moving in. They've been watching the estate for days. We think there's a leak, someone close." The words barely registered before a gunshot cracked in the distance, followed by another, closer this time. Dante turned immediately, his men scattering into formation with mechanical precision. But before anyone could react, a car skidded into the driveway, black tires screeching against wet gravel. The door opened, and two of his guards dragged a man out, his face bloodied, his hands bound behind his back. Matteo. The sight made Dante freeze. For the first time since I'd known him, his mask slipped, and what I saw there wasn't rage, it was heartbreak. "You?" Dante said, his voice barely audible. "You betrayed me?" Matteo met his gaze, something like sorrow passing through his eyes. "It wasn't supposed to be like this. They said they'd leave her alone if—" Dante's gun was in his hand before I even saw him reach for it. "If what?" he demanded, his voice shaking now, the fury breaking through the control. "If I gave them a way in," Matteo whispered. "If I told them where to find her. Her. Me." The world tilted. The rain started then, sudden and relentless, drumming against the stone like the echo of everything falling apart. Dante didn't move for a long time, didn't speak, didn't even breathe. And when he finally did, it was like something inside him had shattered beyond repair. "Get her inside," he said, his voice flat, dead. "Dante," I started, but he didn't look at me. "Now." Lorenzo's hand closed around my arm, pulling me toward the door, but I fought him, my voice breaking. "Don't do this, Dante, he's your friend." "He was my brother," Dante said, and there was such emptiness in his tone that it scared me more than any violence could. "And he sold you to the men who killed my real one." The next sound was deafening, a single shot that cut through the rain like a scream. Matteo fell, blood mixing with the mud at Dante's feet. I stopped fighting. I couldn't move, I couldn't breathe. When Dante turned toward me, his face was unreadable. His hands were shaking, but his voice wasn't. "Do you understand now?" he said. "This is what love costs in my world. It kills everything it touches." Tears blurred my vision, but I forced the words out anyway. "Then why keep me here? Why not let me go before it kills me too?" He took a step toward me, rain sliding down his face like tears he refused to shed. "Because I can't." For a moment, we stood there in the storm, two people trapped in the same hell, neither willing to save the other. And then, just as suddenly as it had begun, the courtyard erupted again, Shouts, engines, the staccato rattle of automatic fire. Dante turned toward the noise, shouting orders, his men scattering, and in the chaos, someone grabbed me from behind. A cloth pressed against my mouth. The smell, chemical, sharp, final. My vision blurred, the world tilting sideways. I caught one last glimpse of Dante turning, his eyes wide as he saw me being pulled away, his voice breaking as he shouted my name. Aria! Then everything went black. When I woke, the world was silent in that wrong way, the way it gets after something violent has happened, when the air still remembers the sound of screams, but pretends it doesn't. My head throbbed, every pulse of blood behind my eyes a reminder that I was still alive, and for a moment I couldn't tell where I was. The room around me was dim, windowless, the smell of damp concrete and metal lingering like an afterthought, and I knew even before I tried the door that it would be locked. My wrists ached from where someone had tied them, the rope now gone but its memory carved deep into my skin, and my throat burned from the chemical taste of whatever they'd used to knock me out. I sat up slowly, the world tilting, and tried to piece the night together. The courtyard, the gunshot, Matteo's body collapsing into mud, the flash of headlights, the sound of Dante shouting my name as someone dragged me away. And the realization hit me like cold water. I was in their hands now. Romano's men. The ones who had haunted Dante's nightmares and turned my life into collateral damage. For a long while, I just sat there listening. There were voices somewhere beyond the walls. Low, masculine, calm in that terrifying way that told you they'd done this before. Every once in a while, a door slammed or a laugh echoed, and I wondered if they even knew who I was beyond the story they'd been told. The woman who made the devil laugh. The weakness they could use to break him. The thought made my chest ache. I should have been angry, furious even, that Dante had dragged me into this world of blood and bargains, but all I could think of was his face when I was taken. The raw panic in his eyes, the way he had looked at me like losing me would undo everything he'd fought to survive. And maybe that was the cruelest part of all. That even now, after everything, a part of me still believed that under all his darkness, he had loved me the only way he knew how. Fiercely, ruinously, completely. Time passed without meaning. I don't know how long I sat there before the door opened, flooding the room with harsh light. A man stepped in, tall, scarred, his smile a thin slice of mockery. "You're awake," he said, his accent thick, his tone almost polite. "Good, makes things easier." "Where am I?" I asked, my voice rasping. He smirked. "Close enough for him to come find you, that's the point. Him. Dante." He crouched beside me, his cologne sharp and expensive, the kind of scent that tried to disguise rot. "You know what he is, don't you?" he murmured. "A murderer, a thief, a man who built his kingdom on other people's bones. And yet you, little dove, you made him laugh. You made him forget who he was. That's dangerous." I met his gaze, forcing myself not to flinch. "Then kill me and get it over with." He laughed softly, standing again. "Oh no, you don't understand. You're not bait. You're proof. Proof that even devils can bleed." He left then, locking the door behind him, but the words stayed. Proof. It wasn't just about hurting Dante. It was about showing the world that he could be undone by something as simple as love. And suddenly, I wasn't scared anymore. I was angry. Not at him, not even at them, but at the whole damned structure of men who thought they could own the things that made them human. Hours later, maybe less, maybe more, the ground trembled. Not much, just enough to rattle the dust from the ceiling. Then came the sound. Faint at first, then growing louder, closer, like thunder rolling through the bones of the earth. Shouts followed. Gunfire, the echo of chaos. And I knew, before I even heard his voice, that Dante had found me. The door burst open, splintering against the wall. Smoke filled the air, acrid and metallic. He stepped through it like a ghost made of fury, his suit torn, blood on his hands, eyes burning with that impossible mixture of rage and relief. For a heartbeat, the world narrowed to just him. The man I loved, the man I feared, the man who would destroy everything, including himself, to save me. "Arya," he said, my name cracking in his throat like it hurt to speak. I wanted to run to him, but my legs wouldn't move. "Dante, don't—" He didn't let me finish. He crossed the room in 2 long strides, untied what was left of my bindings, his hands trembling as they touched my skin. "You're safe now," he whispered, the same words he'd said 100 times before, only now they sounded like an apology. But before I could answer, the gunfire returned, closer, deafening. One of Romano's men appeared in the doorway, weapon raised. Dante turned, pulling me behind him, and everything happened in a blur. The flash, the sound, the smell of blood and smoke. The man fell first. Then Dante did. "Dante!" I screamed, catching him as he staggered. The blood spreading across his side was too dark. Too much. He gritted his teeth, trying to stay upright, but I could feel the tremor in his body. "Don't cry," he said, forcing a smile that looked nothing like the ones he'd given me before. "It doesn't suit you." "Shut up," I whispered, pressing my hands against the wound. "You're going to be fine. Just stay with me." His hand came up, weakly, resting against my cheek. "You remember what I told you?" he murmured. "That love kills everything it touches?" "Don't," I said, shaking my head, tears spilling freely now. "Don't you dare say goodbye." He laughed, soft and broken. "I was wrong, Arya. It doesn't kill. It saves, even men like me." He tried to say more, but the sound that came out was a breath, a sigh, the quiet surrender of someone who had spent his entire life fighting and had finally decided to stop. His eyes met mine one last time, and then they went still. For a long while, I couldn't move. The world outside the room roared, shouting, sirens, footsteps. But inside, everything was silent. I held him there, my hands, stained with his blood, my heart beating too fast to bear. And in that unbearable stillness, something inside me shifted. Not broken, not exactly, but changed in a way that would never be undone. They found us hours later, Lorenzo and the others, faces pale and hollow. They took him from my arms gently, like they were afraid he might still feel pain, and when they tried to lead me out, I followed without protest. Not because I wanted to, but because I couldn't think of anything else to do. The city was waking when we returned. The sun rose pale over the rooftops, casting gold light on streets still stained with blood. Reporters would call it a massacre. Politicians would whisper about power shifts, revenge, retribution. But none of that mattered. What mattered was that the man the world had feared most had died trying to protect the one thing he thought might make him human again. In the days that followed, I stayed in his house. Not because I had to, but because leaving felt impossible. His scent lingered in the halls, his laughter haunted the empty rooms. Sometimes I swore I could still hear his footsteps pacing the study, the faint clink of glass against wood. I painted again, eventually. Not the bright, hopeful things I used to paint, but shadows and light. The kind that live between love and ruin. And in every painting, there was always a trace of him. People say that love and death are opposites, but they're wrong. They're twins. Born of the same hunger. To possess, to be remembered, to defy the oblivion waiting for us all. Dante taught me that. He taught me that even monsters crave grace, that even the darkest souls can find beauty, even if only for a moment. I still dream of him sometimes, the way he laughed that night in the cafe, unguarded and almost young, like the world hadn't yet burned him hollow. And when I wake, the ache in my chest isn't grief exactly. It's gratitude. Because for a brief, impossible time, I was loved by a man who had forgotten how. And maybe that's the closest any of us ever get to salvation.